Hi everybody, welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Tuesday on the 12th. And as you know, yesterday was speech number 1 day, and some of you elected to do it via Zoom, and some of you elected to upload your speech, and you have up until midnight on Monday to upload your speech. This is something that I will have all of you review at the ending of today's class. What your attendance question will be for you to review the uploaded speeches that your classmates have posted, and for you to send me via email one strength and one weakness of each of the speeches. And then what I will do is I will compile all of that information and publish that. And today we were supposed to talk about 3 chapters to try to prepare us for speech number 2, which is the informative speech. The first chapter being supporting materials, chapter 6. The second being visual media, chapter 11. And speeches to inform, chapter 12. But I was also looking at our course outline, and I thought I might make some adjustments to give us a little bit more time so that we can put together that second speech. And what the course outline had initially indicated was that the second speech would be delivered this Thursday, but that seems to be a really short turnaround time. So what I'm going to do, and you can see this in the notes below in section 4, and that, or section 3 rather, is that I'm going to flip classes. So the readings we were supposed to do on Friday will now be done on Thursday, and those are the last chapters of the textbook, chapter 13, persuasive speeches, and chapter 14, argumentation and critical thinking. And then I will have you deliver speech number 2, the informative speech, on Friday. So that would give you an additional day to prepare for that informative speech, which is a 10-minute speech. And this particular speech is where you are trying to teach us either how to do something, or you are teaching us about a particular piece of information, and you will be using one audio or one visual, and that's what I'll be discussing today. To go back to speech number 1, however, your autobiographical speech, I will be sending you your feedback for that speech soon, certainly before you deliver your second speech. And also, please send me your outline for your first speech, if you haven't already done so, to my email, and that's ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And basically what we are doing next class, which happens to be Wednesday, is taking quiz number 2. It'll be very similar to quiz number 1, 20 questions, mostly short answer, perhaps a few multiple choice and true false questions. And you can send that via PDF to my email, and I will send that back to you. I will also be posting some sample student speeches for the informative speech for you to review, and hopefully that'll help you with your own informative speech. And what I will ask you to do is what you did with the sample student speeches with the first speech, which is to identify one strength and one weakness, and to post that on our discussion forum. And I'll have a place for that for next class. And also, I would like you to contact me so that sometime this week you can set up some sort of a practice session for your informative speech prior to Friday, which is when you will be delivering it. And you can do your practice session either via Zoom or phone or chat or email. So just send me an email and we can make arrangements. And for the delivery of speech number 2, you have the similar option of what you had with speech number 1. You can either upload that speech, and I'll have a section on our class Moodle site for you to be able to do that, or you can set up a time on that Friday for a Zoom session. So if you think you're interested in presenting your speech via Zoom, please contact me about your availability for that particular class, which again happens to be on Friday the 15th. So you've got an additional day, so we can see if we can find the common time. So speech number 2, the informative speech, is a 10-minute speech. The idea behind speech number 1 is that you've already had the opportunity to practice with some of the techniques that the textbook and I have suggested with the topic that you know very well, which happens to be your own life history. Now we're moving forward to an informative speech about a topic in which you are going to teach us something. I suggest particularly for a condensed class, such as an intersession class, to choose a topic that you already have some familiarity with so that you don't have to spend a lot of time doing research. And many times what students will do is that they will choose a topic for the informative speech, and then they will use that as a springboard for their persuasive speech, which will be next week, the last speech of this semester, where you are trying to convince us of something. In fact, sometimes students will even take an idea that they discussed in their autobiographical speech and use that idea for their informative speech, and perhaps even use that again for the persuasive speech. So you could have all three speeches connect. Not that you necessarily have to do that. They could be three separate topics. And in terms of the informative speech, you might want to think about some of the classes that you've taken in the past, because there could be a subject that you might want to share with us that you've learned about in another class. You might want to think about papers that you've written in the past, because you might have examined a subject that you could adapt for an informative speech. And in terms of that informative speech, you basically are teaching the audience. And on page 196, if you've got the text that I've ordered for the class, you can see that they give you some suggestions about thinking about people that you can inform us about, places perhaps that you can inform us about, things that you could perhaps inform us about, events that you could perhaps inform us about, ideas perhaps that you could inform us about, and procedures that you could perhaps inform us about. And you can explain or tell, or you can demonstrate or show, or do a combination of the two. In terms of speeches that demonstrate, food demonstrations are very popular. Now, obviously, we aren't meeting in person, so it's not as if you could share the results of your recipe with the class. But if you've ever watched a cooking show, you know how you could go about perhaps presenting. That said, obviously, you're going to have to make adaptations because you've got only 10 minutes. So you may want to perhaps condense elements of it. And again, the focus is less on the actual recipe, and the focus is more on you telling us about that recipe and showing us how to make that particular recipe. And you can also do that with arts and crafts. I've seen many speeches where individuals have made things from decorative bows to floral arrangements to stained glass windows. Again, you have to think about the timing of the thing. I had one speech that actually informed us on how to change the oil in our car, and we actually heard that speech outdoors in the GCC parking lot. That worked very well because it was a summer class. Obviously, that's something that we couldn't do today. There was an informative speech from a used car salesman about how to negotiate to buy a used car. And I could tell you that the audience was in rapt attention in that particular speech. And these speeches might require a question and answer period. And there are a couple of ways that you can address this. You can devote some of the speech time to questions and answers. Again, think about balance. You don't want to have the majority of the speech devoted to questions and answers. So you can assume something like 2 or 3 minutes. But if you don't have questions, then ultimately what you're going to have to do is fill in that space. Now, this is applicable for those of you who would be presenting via Zoom. For those of you who are uploading your speech, you probably will not have interaction with the audience. But if you can anticipate perhaps what a common question might be and address that question, that could be very useful to the audience members. Think about how we talked about how notoriously poor listening skills and memory skills are for the average audience member. So in terms of adapting your information, you want to limit your points. You want to use transitions. You want to avoid jargon or very specialized language that would only be understood by a small group of people. You should assume a general audience. Clustering like ideas to help us remember things. Associating new ideas with old information to again help us remember. Using repetition, probably more so than you would do in your writing, to help us remember. Motivating the audience. Sometimes you have to encourage the audience to be invested in a topic. And I think I told you about the informative speech that I once heard about the Heimlich maneuver, where the speaker actually staged a fake choking in the class in order to motivate the audience to be invested in the topic of the Heimlich maneuver. Again, some topics already have some investment value already embedded with them. Usually I call those topics the public service topics, where you are teaching the audience something that is going to be of some use to them. I do remember a speech that I once heard about skin cancer, where actually one of the audience members was very concerned because it seemed that many of the visuals that the speaker was showing was similar to a mole that the audience member had on their own skin, and they basically went to a doctor to verify that they were fine, and luckily they were. But can you imagine if it turns out that this person had found out that they had skin cancer through a speech? And of course, we're taking this class in order to be able to satisfy a requirement, but this goes way beyond the requirement. So I've heard speeches about fire safety and what those speeches that I call public safety or public service speeches. But again, your speech can be just about anything. I believe that you probably know that I'm a pretty strong dog lover. If you don't know, I particularly love pugs. If I needed to give an informative speech, I would be very tempted to talk about pugs, something that I'm very passionate about and I know a lot about. I'm also passionate about Shakespeare, and I know a lot about Shakespeare, and that would also be a temptation that I would have to discuss in my speech. But basically, it's up to you, and one of the things we'll talk about in the practice session is ultimately what topic you're choosing. And think about addressing different learning styles and that we all learn differently. And it's one of the things that teachers oftentimes do. There's a reason why we do things like not only have presentations, but we usually will use a whiteboard, or in the case of this particular class, I will post the notes below our video because some people learn better through visuals and reading rather than through orally and listening. So as many different learning styles as you can utilize to help an audience to remember the information, then the more useful it is. But remember, you've got only 10 minutes, so less is more probably in terms of what it is that you are trying to teach us. And using visual media is definitely one of the ways that you can appeal to different learning styles, as well as audio media, and that's why an audio visual is going to be a requirement for this particular speech. I stopped counting after one, but you can use as many audio visuals as you'd like. You can go from low tech, which happens to be something like a poster or a prop, and you can do some more high tech, which can be, let's say, Zoom screen sharing if you're on Zoom, or if you wanted to add an audio or video clip. Again, think about balance. The majority of the speech should be about you, not your audio visual. So definitely you want to devote most of the speech to your presentation, but think about maybe a couple of minutes, two, perhaps no more than three, devoted to an audio visual. And there are pros and cons to all of the audio visuals that you could use. Some suggestions, though, is that you do want to be professional. You do want to test your equipment beforehand to make sure that it's working correctly. You want to have a backup plan, particularly if you are presenting live, so that if it turns out that you have some sort of technical or mechanical failure. I know that people tend to be very enamored with PowerPoint. I myself have no problems with PowerPoint, though I've seen PowerPoint misused and abused, and I suspect you probably have as well, from either a speaker basically presenting their entire speech on PowerPoint, which again, we weren't there to read the PowerPoint, we were there to hear and watch the speaker, to too much text on the PowerPoint, to too much distractions on the PowerPoint. It's called, just because you can, that doesn't mean you should. Too many colors and fonts and styles so that it becomes confusing. Basically, it should just be keywords and phrases to supplement what it is you're saying. Using color effectively on PowerPoint so that you want to make sure that your background color isn't washing out the text. Making sure everything is spelled correctly. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an English teacher, but nothing is worse than basically making a text large and then having a spelling error within it. But of course, these are issues that you could find with other props as well. You might decide to use a chart. And again, you got to think about making sure that the chart is professional and making sure that it's visible to your audience and that it's not too complex. Charts tend to work very well with numbers. pictures tend to work very well with emotions, and we tend to be made up of both. So usually thinking about how to appeal to someone's intellect, but also how to appeal to someone's emotional backup, or their emotional makeup. And in fact, when we get to the persuasive speech, it'll become increasingly important to appeal to both. You want to be clear, you want to be simple, you want to be neat, you want to make sure that you're using color for interest. Avoid all caps. It's very difficult to read text that's in all caps. So generally speaking, what you want to do is reserve that for very important points. And an interesting point that studies have found is that people more likely remember text that's bolded rather than underlined or italicized. So if you really want something to stand out, bold it rather than underline it. So that said, there are lots of different ways you can go about your audiovisual, and that's something else that we can talk about as well in our practice session. What audiovisual do you think you want to use? And based on your mode of delivery, whether it be Zoom or uploading your speech via video, what is the best way to present that? An audiovisual, something like a handout, would work very well if we were meeting live, but obviously wouldn't work very well in this particular situation. So you would probably want to think about something else. Handouts work very well, by the way, if you want your audience to leave with something, or if you want them to remember something because you've written it out, or if you have very sensitive information that perhaps you're afraid that the audience wouldn't want to be seen writing down, then you could just provide them with a handout. Now, this particular speech does not require supporting material, though you might decide that you need to do outside research for supporting material. You will definitely need to use supporting material for speech 3. And for speech 3, the 15-minute persuasive speech, that's where I'm going to ask you to try to convince your audience of a particular policy or to take a particular action or both. And using outside resources, I will ask you to use 3 for that particular speech. Only helps the audience in terms of persuading them about the validity of your argument. And we'll talk a little bit about how to incorporate those. The good news is that it's not nearly as complex as what you would do if you were writing an academic paper. Because as you know, if you're writing an academic paper, you've got to cite your resources or cite your sources very carefully. And that means within the body of the text and also at the ending of the text. And there are lots of different styles and techniques for doing this. In the humanities, and that includes things like public speaking and English classes, that would be the MLA, or the Modern Language Association, where basically parentheses are used within the body of the text to indicate minimal amounts of information about where that information came from. It could be as little as, let's say, a page number. And then at the very ending of the paper, there's a works cited page where you've got all of the details of all of the sources that were quoted, from name of author to name of text, of publisher, time of publication, and place of publication, and so forth. It's a little bit different when you are citing using the APA system, the American Psychological System, that's used for basically the sciences. For us in public speaking, again, you have to think about what's going to be most reasonable and valuable for the audience. The audience definitely wants to be cued in so that they know when you are using information that isn't yours, but they probably don't want to be inundated with detail. So you can very easily just use a tag within the context of your speech and state something like, according to researchers. And that's basically the cue that whatever information you're sharing after that is obviously not yours. Of course, you should be prepared for an audience member to ask you a question about where you found that information, and then you should be able to share that with your audience. But again, the idea is that you want to try to make it as realistic as possible for your audience. And I don't think an audience member would really want you to present something in APA or MLA format. They would just want to have the basic information so that they could verify the source on their own if they so wanted to. So that's basically what you would have to do with citing a source. And in the context of this class, since you are writing speaking outlines and I'm asking to review those speaking outlines, you can just list your sources on those speaking outlines just so that I can take a quick peek at them. Again, you don't have to put them in any particular style or format, APA, MLA, it doesn't really much matter. Just as long as you've got the basics that an audience member might ask you about in terms of where you got that information from. And again, this is relevant for the third speech, but I mention it now just in the event that some of you want to do some outside research for your second speech. And again, this is also something that we can talk about during our practice session. Using supporting material increases the credibility and the persuasiveness of the speaker. You definitely want to make sure that you are being accurate with your resources, and I encourage you to use the GCC Library database and the GCC Library website rather than going on the open net. Not that I'm averse to going on Google and finding information, but you know the internet is public access, which is why it's wonderful, but also problematic at the same time. Anyone can post anything. So if you're using something that you find on the open internet, then you need to verify and make sure that that information is correct. That said, you probably should always verify information, but if you're using a library resource, chances are that a librarian has reviewed that information and has verified it at least on some level. And the GCC library databases, if you don't have experience using them, it appears as if you are on the internet, but you're really not, because these are basically paywalls that you need to access. And GCC and academic institutions pay those fees so that you can have access to that online information that's been vetted, that has been reviewed by experts to verify its authenticity, at least in some level. You know, I always encourage individuals to have a certain level of skepticism. I'll never forget, and this was quite a while ago in the early days of the Iraqi war, and it would have been a New York Times reporter, the New York Times being considered the newspaper of record, was sent on assignment to interview the soldier's family from the Iraqi war. And the soldier's family supposedly gave this reporter an interview, and it appeared in the newspaper. The difficulty that occurred, however, is that the family called the newspaper after the article appeared and said they never spoke to any reporter, and there were some basic facts that were definitely incorrect, things like the color of their home, for instance. And when the New York Times did some research, they found out that the reporter had never interviewed this particular family, even though that was his assignment. His name is Jason Blair. Instead, what he was doing was having lunch in a Manhattan restaurant and charging that lunch to the New York Times business account. Not very smart in terms of covering your tracks. And as they continue to do more research, they found that this was a habit of his, basically to create fiction for his stories rather than to go on assignment the way he was supposed to do and get information. And I remember when the story came out, how horrified everybody was about how a newspaper with the respect of the New York Times could have a reporter on their staff that would do such a thing, and editors that wouldn't have caught such a thing. And if that particular soldier's family had never called the New York Times, I wonder if that reporter would still be there fabricating stories. And I always use this as an example of that. Regardless of the source, you always want to have a certain level of skepticism. But there are some sources that are more trustworthy than others. And I couldn't put it better than how one of my colleagues had discussed the differences between being on the open internet and being on a database. And they compared it to safe sex. And that safe sex would be basically being on a database. Something could go wrong, but it's unlikely. As opposed to being on the open net, which they compare to unsafe sex. Chances are you'll be fine, but do you want to take the risk? And I can't think of a better way of thinking about doing research as well, to rely on academic libraries. That's what they're there for, and the librarians are there to assist. Now, of course, obviously, you can't go in person into the library, considering our current situation, but as long as you've got a library card, it will provide you with a code that will allow you to access all of the resources. And it's very easy to get that card and that code if you don't already have one. You can go onto the library website, which I've included below on in our notes under the section supporting material, which happens to be section 6. and you can easily either apply for a library card online, or you can access a librarian via phone or chat or email or social media. They try to be as available as possible so that you can get a library card or ask them for any assistance that you might need with your research. So that said, there are other kinds of research you can use as well. Interviews can work very well, particularly if you're interviewing somebody who has a certain level of expertise about the topic that you are discussing. Again, we talked about ethos and ethics and being ethical. If you are interviewing somebody, you want to let them know why you're interviewing them, how you're going to use their information, get the permission that you need in order to share their information and their identity. If they object to you sharing their identity, you want to offer them a pseudonym, things of that nature. And the different kinds of research you can use. You can use qualitative, which is basically anecdotes or stories, or quantitative, and those are basically facts and statistics. Both have value and both have weaknesses. So if you think about qualitative and anecdotes, that yes, certainly there is a certain level of validity from hearing from, let's say, students who've attended GCC about their experiences. However, that doesn't necessarily encompass everyone's experience. So you could look at quantitative or facts, things like survey results, for instance. But that said, that also negates the personal experiences that individuals have had. If you've ever had any experience with test scores, you know that test scores are quantitative, but they may or may not necessarily tell the true story about how much learning you've done. So you can do a combination of the two. And when we get to talking about using supporting materials, obviously you can use books and magazine articles, but most people probably feel comfortable with using websites. And again, you want to verify that you're using whatever information you're using, that it has a certain level of authenticity to it and a certain level of validity to it. And I'm going to ask you for your last speech to use 3 outside resources, and then I stop counting, but you can use as many as you'd like. Just like with the second speech, I'm asking you to use 1 audio or visual, but you can use as many as you like, and I can stop counting after the first. And they all have their pros and cons. As I indicated, if you're using technology, there always is the problem of a technological failure. If you're using something like a picture, you have to think about scale and visibility. The same thing with if you're using a prop. If you're working with an audience in person, do you want that audience to handle the prop? Even something as easy as using a blackboard or a whiteboard, which you would normally do for just a quick piece of information, has its challenges. If you've never written on a blackboard or a whiteboard, it might feel uncomfortable to you. The size might not be appropriate for the audience. The whiteboard may not necessarily have dry erase markers that have ink in them. So again, there are lots of different ways that you can go about using audio or visual. And audio works just as well as visual as well. So you can do things like music, video clips, and so forth. So think about what kind of audiovisual aid would be useful for your topic and also would be beneficial for your audience. And also think about your comfort level in terms of what you think might be appropriate for you to do. I didn't want to make you or encourage you, or I didn't want to require you, that's the word I'm searching for, to use an audiovisual for your first speech, because we were just beginning to talk about intros, bodies, and conclusions, breathing deeply, things of that nature. But now that you've had some experience, we can move forward and begin to talk a little bit about incorporating an audiovisual. And in fact, for the autobiographical speech, when I asked you to review the sample student speeches, many of you had indicated that the second speech was a speech where the speaker actually used some props and that you found that to be positive. However, the speaker didn't really interact with those props naturally, and that would have been a negative. So again, you have to think about your presentation. So those were just some things to consider about visual media and also about informative speeches. And lastly, using outside resources if you think that's something that you would like to do. So just to give you an idea of where we are next week, because believe it or not, next week is the ending of our semester. We will have a long holiday. On Monday, the 18th, we have Martin Luther King Day, which means we have a 3-day weekend. And then we move into Tuesday, the 19th, where we would have quiz 3, another practice session. And then I wanted you to think about how you might like to proceed with speech number 3, the persuasive speech that's 15 minutes. Depending on the size of the class, we can devote 2 classes to that speech number 3, which is what I had done. Or if the class is small enough, we can do it all in 1 class. Right now we have 13 students, so we're sort of in the middle. We can go either way. So if you could send me your preference, if you do have a strong preference as to whether or not you would like to have speech number 3 next week, divided up over 2 classes or just with 1 class. If we did it over 1 class, what I thought we would do is after our quiz on Tuesday the 19th, on the 20th, which would be a Wednesday, would just be a day where you could prepare for your speech. And then all of the speeches would be on Thursday the 21st. If it turns out that you want to do speech number 3 over 2 classes, we'll do them over Wednesday the 20th and Thursday the 21st. And then end up finally on Friday the 21st with quiz number 4. And that's our last quiz for the semester. I dropped the lowest quiz grade, so sometimes students elect not to take the last quiz if they've done well with their first 3 quizzes, and that perhaps is your little reward for finishing an intersession course that you could finish just 1 class early. Of course, you know, things could change if we happen to have inclement weather, which would interfere with, let's say, our internet, but thus far the weather has been quite nice and quite accommodating. So again, to recap, if you could please let me know if you have a strong preference as to whether or not you think as a class we should present speech 3 over 1 class, which would be Thursday the 21st, and that would be all 13 of us, whether you upload or present via Zoom. Or if you think that we should divide the class up, because it is a 15-minute speech, and do half of the speeches on Wednesday and half of the speeches on Thursday. My personal preference, if you're curious, I'm thinking that it just might make sense to do everything in 1 class on Thursday if everyone, or at least the majority of the class, is going to be uploading their speech, which is what I've seen thus far. But again, I'm curious to hear your feedback, and I'll get back to you about that. And where you are, I will post our quiz for you to take next class, as well as some sample student speeches for you to respond to. But where you are is sending me your outline for speech number 1, your autobiographical speech, to my email if you haven't already done so, and contacting me about speech 2. First, how you would like to do your practice session, and secondly, if you think you want to present speech 2, your 10-minute informative speech, via Zoom, please let me know what your availability is, and that again is for Friday. I wanted to change the dates a little bit, so Friday the 15th, so that you've got just a little bit more time to prepare for that informative speech. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And next class, I will post the quiz. And do keep in mind that I've got an optional chat on Tuesdays at 1 o'clock from 1 to 1:30, and an optional Zoom on Thursdays from 1 to 1:30 if you wanted to touch base with me. Though, of course, you could always make an appointment as well. Take care. Bye-bye.